Thank you, Professor Mahbubani, for taking the time to speak with us today. I don't think many people know you studied philosophy in university, given your academic and diplomatic work. But I would like to ask you, why did you decide to study philosophy in university? I know you have a bachelor's in philosophy from NUS, as well as a master's from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. I would like to ask, how did that happen, and how did you get an interest in doing philosophy? And on a lesser note, what was it like to study in Canada in the 1970s?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to begin by emphasizing that studying philosophy was probably the best decision I ever made in my life. But it's not something that I discovered, how do you say, at a very young age. It's just that when I went to university in 1967 at the National University of Singapore, which is then called the University of Singapore, by the way. And I ended up studying 3 subjects in my first year: economics, sociology, and philosophy. And somewhat unusually, in fact, I was the only student in NUS that went on to study 3 subjects in my second year: economics, sociology, and philosophy. But I discovered very quickly in my second year that my economics lessons were interesting, but the lessons were very rigid. The professors expected you to memorize the answers. And sociology was okay, but the thing that really got me excited was philosophy. I felt, it was Yeats who says education is not about filling a bucket, but about lighting a fire. Every time I went into the philosophy classroom, I felt that my brain caught fire. So as a result of that, I decided to repeat my second year. In fact, my president's scholarship had to be suspended for 1 year because I was repeating a year. And I went on to do single subject philosophy for 2 years. And of course, it was a great decision. And that was followed, as you mentioned earlier, by a 1-year master's program in Dalhousie in 1975, 74, 75. And that was because the head of the Department of Philosophy in Singapore went to become the head of Department of Philosophy in Dalhousie, and he gave me a fellowship to study there. And I think I credit a lot my successful career, especially in diplomacy, to my studies in philosophy, because philosophy emphasizes a lot of questioning, a lot of rigorous analysis, and all the skills that I learned in philosophy proved to be very helpful, both in my diplomatic career and as well as my academic and writing career too.
What was it like being, studying in Canada in the 1970s?
It was very lonely. Because, Halifax, the town of Halifax, is a very sleepy town in Canada, small little town. And there are not many foreign students there. I mean, I did make a few friends, but most of the time I was by myself. And I was very poor then because I was living on the fellowship of $200 a month. And the only room I could afford to rent was a corridor. And I slept in a sawed-off corridor, which became a bedroom in somebody's house. And in winter, to save money, they didn't turn on the heat in the house. So I was very cold. So I had to sleep in a sleeping bag in my bedroom because there's no heating. I mean, that was until December. Then in January, I changed.
I see.
But in terms of of course, I focused very much on studying Karl Marx and John Rawls. My thesis was on the concept of the freedom and equality in the writings of Karl Marx and John Rawls. And what's interesting is that a subject that I was studying in 74, 75 has now become more relevant than ever, because if you read my latest book, As China Won, in chapter 7, I devote an entire chapter to discussing plutocracy. where you have a government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich in the United States of America. And both Karl Marx and John Rawls, they disagreed on many things, but they warned against a plutocracy emerging in any society. So what I studied in some ways almost 50 years ago is now proving useful to understanding the contemporary state of the United States of America.
Well, speaking of the past, when you were younger, you once said that you wanted to be a technician, or that you have ended up as a salesman. I thought this was an interesting and alternative to the career that you've had. But I'd like to ask, why a technician, and why a salesman? Why did you have these two possibilities in mind?
Well, you know, I think you know this. I came from a very poor family, and in a very poor neighborhood, in a very poor Singapore then. And no one I knew had gone to university. I didn't know anybody who had gone to university. Not one person as a child. So I thought the highest you can achieve in your life is to become a technician. So that's how I ended up in Tanjung Katong Technical School, which was a good thing because I failed my metalwork exam in secondary 3. You know, you have to make a hinge. And if you make a hinge, you know, you got one side, it's got to have 3 parts, the other side 2 parts. And so they fit in and then you get a hinge. But I made a hinge, one side 3 parts, one side 3 parts, and they couldn't fit. So I failed. And because I failed, I ended up going to the last class in Tanjung Katong Secondary School in secondary 4G. And I ended up studying the humanities, which is the best thing that happened to me because I discovered I've had affinity for studying the humanities rather than technical subjects. And as for the salesman part, you know, I'm ethnically a Sindhi, and most Sindhis end up going to business and making a lot of money. That's what Sindhis are supposed to do. But the former architect Albert Hong sadly passed away. He used to introduce me as a Sindhi who failed because I went to government and I didn't make a lot of money like people in business. That's what being a salesman is what generally all Sindhis do.
I see. Well, speaking of the humanities, I'd like to ask, how did you get involved with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where you were its founding dean? And why did you stay in Singapore during the academic phase of your life? I'm sure if you wanted to, you could have moved anywhere else in the world. You could work in universities, institutions, anywhere you wanted probably. But why did you stay in Singapore?
Well, I mean, I must say that you know, in life, one thing I'll tell any young person this: in life is about lucky breaks, and it was just a complete accident of history that Lee Kuan Yew turned 80 in 2013, and so the government, 2003, 2003. So the government decided to name an institution after him. And 2003 is also when Singapore got off the Security Council. So in 2001, 2002, I was the Singapore ambassador to the UN and the first, and so far the only Singapore ambassador to have served on the UN Security Council. So 2003, my job finished and I didn't know what exactly I was going to do. 2003, Lee Kuan Yew turned 80. And then that same year, the then Deputy Prime Minister, Tony Tan, came to New York and he hosted me to a one-on-one lunch. And he said, we're setting up a school of public policy named after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. It's the first institution that he's allowed to have named after him. And would you agree to be the dean? I said, sure. I mean, I didn't know what to do. And I knew people. I spent a year in Harvard, and I became friends with some of the leading Harvard professors there, like Samuel Huntington, Ezra Vogel, Joseph Nye. And I realized that the life of an academic is a very privileged life because you get paid to think. You know, so I was very happy And also, it's always a big challenge to build up a new institution from scratch. And no other country would have made me dean uh, except Singapore. So it was a real godsend. And my 13 years as dean were among the happiest years of my life.
That's wonderful to hear. I'd like to ask you, what was it like doing your 33 years with the Singapore Foreign Service, traveling around the world, meeting with people of different cultures and systems? I'd like to ask what that experience was like, and what would you recommend it to anyone? And I understand that you did work in the United Nations, and you became the president of the UN Security Council for a time, as well as being Singapore's ambassador to the UN. But what was that experience like? And did you enjoy all of your time during this diplomatic period of your career?
Well, I must say, I also enjoyed my 33 years in the Singapore diplomatic service. I didn't join out of choice. I mean, I was forced to join the Singapore Foreign Service because I was bonded to the Singapore government. And, you know, when you get a president's scholarship, which actually saved my life, that's how I ended up at university. I was bonded to the government for 5 years. I was actually determined to quit the government after 2 or 3 years. In fact, I was on the verge of quitting when I went to study philosophy in Canada in 1974. But the then permanent secretary, George Bogas, was a very wise man. He said, why don't you take no pay leave and don't quit? And I'm glad, because when I came back in 75, the economy was in bad shape, and I was lucky that I had a job to do in the Singapore Foreign Service. And I've enjoyed all my postings, but of course, my most exciting posting was to serve in Cambodia in Phnom Penh in 1973-74, when the city was shelled every day. And so even my house that I lived in was hit by shrapnel. And in fact, we had glass windows, and the glass windows all flew when a bomb fell near my house in Phnom Penh. So in my foreign service career, I served in Phnom Penh, Cambodia during the war, in Kuala Lumpur, 76 to 79, in Washington, D.C., and twice as the Singapore ambassador to the UN from 84 to 89 when I took over from Tomiko, and then from 1998 to 2004 when Singapore joined the UN Security Council. And again, one of the great privileges in my life is to serve as the Singapore ambassador to UN, because that's why I wrote my book, The Great Convergence, about global governance. And I could not have written a book about global governance if I hadn't served as the Singapore's ambassador on the UN Security Council. And if I also want to add another important point here, the one reason why I've been able to publish 8 books in my life, 7 of them were published after I left the Foreign Service. I was able to write 7 books because I spent 33 years in the Singapore Foreign Service. And I was very lucky because the leaders of Singapore who were analyzing global geopolitical developments, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, I got to know all 3 of them. And all 3 were geopolitical geniuses, really geniuses. And I learned a fantastic amount from them. So in a sense, you can describe my life as spending 33 years of learning in the Singapore Foreign Service, which then produced 7 books after I left the Foreign Service.
Well, speaking of your writing, you are a prolific writer, and I did read that you listened to Mohammed Rafi while writing. That helped to produce a lot of pieces. I'd like to ask if this is still true 10 years later, and which of his records do you like the most? Do you like his slower songs, or do you like his more fast-paced ones?
Well, I mean, I can't figure out why I cannot write without Mohammed Rafi. But I suspect one reason is that I listened to Mohammed Rafi when I was a child. And to be honest, actually, when I traveled around the world, I actually stopped listening to him. But when I started writing my second book, Beyond the Age of Innocence, and I started writing it in New York, I discovered that I could write better when my Muhammad Rafi was on. And I don't have a scientific theory for why this is the case, but I think one reason is that because I listened to Muhammad Rafi as a child every day, when I put Muhammad Rafi on, my sort of childlike neurons in my brain pop up. And so my writing is much, much better than I without Muhammad Rafi. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be, it can be any kind of song, slow or fast, but it's just amazing that I can, on a good Saturday morning, write 3,000 words. On a good Sunday morning, write 3,000 words. And that's 6,000 words a weekend, listening to Muhammad Rafi. And so a good book is about, most of my books are about 80,000 words. So in 13 or 14 weekends, I can produce a book, which is quite good. But of course, you have to spend a year thinking about it before you start writing. So for example, my latest book has China One. I spent all of 2018 going on a sabbatical to 6 universities, Columbia, Harvard, Fudan, Sionspol, Oxford, Georgetown, and then I wrote a book after spending a year thinking about it. And I'm very grateful that I can write all these books, because one thing amazing about writing books is that I meet people all over the world who have read it. So when you write a book, it's like sending a postcard into space, and you never know which address it will land in. So that's the advantage of writing books over newspaper articles.
I see. Thank you, Professor. That kind of sounds like me and Chet Baker. I get a bit more work done with him. Well, I'd like to ask, what keeps you motivated to write so many books? I mean, you've been writing books for a long time now, and have you considered writing fiction, perhaps a memoir? What is your motivation as a writer?
Well, I think my main motivation as a writer is to make the world a better place. I mean, so in all my books, I don't just do analysis. I also include prescriptions. And Karl Marx once famously said that philosophers have always tried to understand the world. The whole point is to change it. So the goal of my books is to change the world, and not just to understand the world. And I hope in some areas that I made a difference. I would love to write a fiction or novel, but to survive in life, to succeed in life, you must know what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. And I think if I tried to write a novel, it would be a disaster. It takes very, very different skills. Although I'm thinking of writing my autobiography, and that's at some point I'll write down, what a privileged life I've had. In a sense, when Lee Kuan Yew wrote his book From Third World to First World, he wrote about it from the larger national point of view. But that's what I experienced. I grew up in the third world Singapore, and I ended up in the first world Singapore. And so that's a great privilege that I've had in my life.
Well, speaking of prescriptions, you've written in your books that international organizations such as the United Nations and the IMF are in need of reforms. That such reforms ought to strengthen these institutions and to update them to the needs of the present day, especially in terms of geopolitical representation. But such change would require leadership. I'd like to ask you what leadership really means here, and what would it really take to change these organizations? And I know you've written a bit about this, but if anyone takes up the challenge, what sort of person or personality do you think this person will have, and where might they come from? Or do you imagine a group of people working together to solve these problems?
I'm going to give away a big secret. And it's true, it's a secret because most people don't seem to know it. The reason why the United Nations is weak is not weak because of an accident. It's weak because of a design by deliberate intention. And so look, for example, at the United States, right? The United States is the world's most powerful country, has been the most powerful country since the end of World War II. And ironically, the United States also set up the United Nations, to prevent World War III from happening. But one thing the United States discovered after having a very strong and dynamic Secretary General like Dag Hammarskjöld in the 1960s is that a strong and dynamic Secretary General like Dag Hammarskjöld can constrain American power because he can act as a moral voice. So after Dag Hammarskjöld, the United States decided, this is the secret, that the UN shall no longer have strong, dynamic Secretary Generals. And what's interesting is that in the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union disagreed on everything, right? The one thing they didn't disagree on is that they should have a weaker Secretary General. And this is what the great powers have been doing. So the reason why the UN has been weak is because the United States has decided to keep it weak. So it has only chosen weak Secretary Generals like Kurt Waldheim. It has cut down the funding to the United Nations because a strong United Nations is a constraint on American power. And this is where, of course, America is actually making a big strategic mistake in keeping the UN weak. And that's why in my book, The Great Convergence, in fact, even my latest book has China Won, I quote former President Bill Clinton as saying that if the United States is going to be number one forever, then fine, United States can keep on doing what it's doing. But Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if you can imagine a world where the United States is no longer number one, then it is in the United States' interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral processes, and multilateral institutions like the UN. So actually, my main argument with the American government, with Americans, is that it is now in American interest to strengthen the UN rather than weaken the UN. That, of course, was impossible under Donald Trump. But I hope that under President Joe Biden, he will listen to the wisdom of Bill Clinton and try to strengthen the organizations like the United Nations.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that, Professor. Well, I'd like to diverge here a little bit and ask you a little bit of a tangent. In recent years, there have been a number of young national leaders. I can think of New Zealand and Finland as examples, who have stepped up on the world stage to lead their countries, but most of them are in their either their late 30s or early 40s. I like to kind of present this radical scenario to you, which I think is very interesting, of a world where all state leaders, or most state leaders, are in their 30s and 40s. I'd like to ask you, I guess to think about it and to ask, from your experience, are there marked differences between younger and older leaders? Given this, I wouldn't say this rise in younger leaders, but this interesting scenario that people are now considering.
Well, I think, it depends it doesn't depend on the age. It depends on the person. So when you remember, Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister of Singapore, self-governing Singapore, in 1959. And he was born in 1923. So he was then 36 years old. And he was Prime Minister from 1959 to 1990 for 31 years. So, which was the better Lee Kuan Yew? The younger Lee Kuan Yew or the older Lee Kuan Yew? And the answer, of course, is both, because it's different times, requires different kinds of leaders. So I don't think we should focus on the age. It depends very much on the character and personality of the person, and whether or not he or she is in tune with the times. And I must say, the one person who impresses me a lot is the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, because she's really, really special, and she's very honest, straightforward, dedicated, unpretentious, and a perfect leader for New Zealand at this time. But in other cases, at the same time, I think with the world America is very lucky that it has a leader like Joe Biden running the United States of America today, even though he's 78 years old, because America today is a very deeply polarized country, very deeply divided country. So you need a sort of a very wise old grandfatherly figure like Joe Biden, who can win the trust and confidence of a wider section of people and bring them together and reunite the United States of America today. So actually, America is lucky that such a grandfatherly figure like Joe Biden, who's actually a very nice guy, has become the Prime Minister of become the President of the United States of America at a time when the country has never been so divided. So leaders is not a question of age, it's a question of the times and the kinds of leaders that you need in the history or phase of development of that country. So for example, China needed a very strong-willed Mao Zedong to fight against the foreign invasions of China, and successfully, as you say, successfully made China stand up. But subsequently, when China had to switch and focus on building its economy, it was good that they switched from a revolutionary leader like Mao, who was a good fighter, to a nation builder like Deng Xiaoping, who did an amazing job in strengthening China. And he was quite older when he took over as the leader of China. So age is completely irrelevant. It depends on the times and the kind of leaders that you need for that particular time.
Thank you, Professor. Well, speaking of character and what people need at a certain time, what do you think should be the ambition of Singapore and Singaporeans going forward? Because in only a few years' time, a lot of our neighbors will be competing with us in areas we have long excelled at. I can think of Vietnam as an example, although not all our neighbors will become like Vietnam. Still, I'd like to ask you, what do you think should be the ambition of Singaporeans, and whether we are doing enough to aspire such dreams and ambitions in the next generation, besides simply arming them with technical and academic knowledge as well as credentials?
I think, Singapore is a very lucky country. It's one of the few countries that have gone from third world to first world. But at the same time, the reason why Singapore succeeded is because it was led by three giants, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, and the others played a role too, but these were the three giants. And they could look at the whole world and see how Singapore could fit in. So it's important for young Singaporeans to be more ambitious and not be so kiasu. That's the fundamental problem with Singapore culture, that we are scared to lose and therefore scared to dream big. But actually, in my book, and Singapore Survive, I've emphasized that this is actually there's as they say, Shakespeare said, right? There's a tide in the affairs of man, which taken that the flood leads to great fortune. That's what Shakespeare said. Right now, Singapore is encountering a great tide, which is the Asian century. And the 21st century will be the Asian century. And the Asian century will need a capital. Because just like in the 19th century was the European century, London was the capital of the European century. The 20th century was the American century, and New York was the capital of the American century, intellectual, moral, financial capital. In the same way, if the 21st century is going to be the Asian century, the only city that qualifies to become the capital of the Asian century is Singapore, because Singapore is the only place where the four major civilizational streams of Asia come together. So Singapore, you have the Chinese civilization in Singapore, you have the Islamic civilization in Singapore, you have the Indian civilization in Singapore, and you have also the Western civilization in Singapore. So Singapore is literally the crossroads of Asia. And so we should position ourselves as the capital of the Asian century. And we are fortunate that we have good ties with China, India, and our fellow ASEAN countries. So we should dream big and position ourselves as the city that everyone in the world wants to go to. And if anyone in the world says, I want to touch and feel what the Asian century is like, the answer is, if you want to touch and feel the Asian century, go to Singapore.
That's fascinating, Professor. Maybe you should write on behalf of a lot of young Singaporeans, I suppose. Maybe you should write a pamphlet for us.
I have discussed this in my book, Can Singapore Survive? I've discussed this possibility.
Maybe you can, put it into a small short form and distribute it through the schools. I think I'll go through Well, thank you for sharing so much. I'd like to ask a few more questions. Given your experiences, what is your dream for Singapore? What is your dream for this country? Because I know you've been quite pragmatic and realistic in your analyses of geopolitical movements and international affairs and where Singapore can be. But given the opportunity to be an idealist for a moment, to you, what would a better world be like? And what are the biggest obstacles to achieving that world? And what do you think the world will be like in a century or two?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm 72 years old. I feel very lucky to be alive at this time because the past 40 years of human history have been the best 40 years of human history in terms of human and social development, right? And the next 30 years could be even better. So I hope that I can live to 100 to see what the next 30 years will be like. Because the Asian countries, especially China, India, Southeast Asia, I think will do very well in terms of economic development. But at the same time, they face a big challenge, which is that the one biggest obstacle to economic and human development is wars. So when you ask about being idealistic, I've decided to utilize my idealistic streak in a practical manner by setting up something called the Asian Peace Program at the National University of Singapore. So if you Google Asian Peace Program, you'll find that we are now publishing one essay every month, trying to give practical solutions to existing geopolitical flashpoints or areas of conflict. So, like for example, we write about the Sino-Indian border, about China-Japan relations, about South China Sea, about terrorism in Southeast Asia. So we are addressing all the hard issues, and I hope that young Singaporeans will see that it is in Singapore's interest to support this kind of peace programs. And I hope young Singaporeans will also follow carefully the Asian Peace Program and see how they can contribute to it in a small way or a big way.
Thank you, Professor. For the last question, this is more lighthearted. I'd like to ask you how you've been during this COVID-19 pandemic and whether there's anything you'd like to do once more restrictions are lifted. Would you like to travel more, or are you fine in Singapore? Whether you have any new ideas for books, or are you thinking of a new third career besides diplomacy and academia?
Well, I think, what, COVID-19 surprisingly has been very good for me because I would normally travel about 20 or 30 times a year at least. and I stopped traveling now for 11 months. So as a result of eating at home more often, I have lost 6 kilograms. And so I'm feeling much healthier. And the best thing I've discovered in COVID-19 period is that it's good to fast 1 day a week. So for 1 day a week, I'll fast for 24 hours from one lunch to the next lunch. And fasting, I've discovered, I've now seen more and more studies which show that fasting is very good for your body. And I would recommend to every Singaporean to fast for 1 day a week because your body will be much better as a result. And so in terms of what I will do, of course, I'll start traveling again. There are some places on my bucket list. I haven't been to the city of Venice. I haven't been to the Grand Canyon. And I haven't been to Kashmir in India. So there are places that I clearly want to go and see as soon as we can travel again. But in some ways, when you ask whether or not I will have a third career, I'm pleased to inform you my third career has already begun. Because right now, in my first two careers, I had to work hard, but I had also had to make sure that I had an income. And now, fortunately, I don't need an income. I'm very comfortable, and I'm now enjoying the freedom of doing what I really want to do. And NUS has been very generous. Is giving me an office and a secretary, and I've raised funding for some research assistance. So as a consequence of which, I think I'll be writing more and publishing more in these coming years. And in fact, during COVID-19, just to give some example, I've been doing exactly what I've been doing with you, which is giving Zoom interviews. And some of my Zoom or video interviews, like one I did with the Institute of New Economic Thinking, has had over 400,000 views. A debate that I had with Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago has had 360,000 views. So the paradox about COVID-19 is that physically I was boxed in my house and boxed in Singapore, but through the virtual realm, I've actually connected with far more people through my writing and Zoom interviews than I have in any other previous years. So the year COVID-19, paradoxically, 2020 was a very good year for me.
Well, thank you, Professor. Hopefully 2021 will be even better, not just for you, but for everyone.
Yes, I hope it will be a better year, especially for Singapore. But I also hope that the Singaporeans will learn to be more adventurous. And one of the most Singaporeans, when they think of traveling, they want to go to London or Paris or New York or Tokyo, but they forget that one of the fastest growth areas in the world is our immediate neighborhood, Southeast Asia. And they should discover what wonderful countries we have in Southeast Asia. You mentioned Vietnam earlier on, but Indonesia is doing very well. And I think Thailand and Malaysia will also bounce back in due course. And so there are lots of opportunities in Southeast Asia. And in fact, the reason why I wrote my book, The ASEAN Miracle, was to tell Singaporeans that we are so blessed that we have ASEAN around us, because ASEAN is like oxygen, you breathe oxygen every day, you take it for granted, not realizing that there's no oxygen, you would die. In the same way, ASEAN is like oxygen for Singapore. If ASEAN dies, we would be in deep trouble. You would have to be put on a life support machine, because ASEAN gives us the political and economic peace and growth and development that we need to succeed as a country. So I would say to young Singaporeans, fall in love with Southeast Asia, fall in love with ASEAN.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. I won't hold you any longer. thank you once again for taking the time to share your thoughts with me.
My pleasure to be with you.
No worries. Thank you very much.